Namaste. Today we have an esteemed guest with us who will be discussing about Hindutva and similar lines. We have Dr. Koenraad Elst to talk with us. Born in Belgium in a Catholic family, Dr. Koenraad Elst has earned MA degrees in Sinology, Indology, and Philosophy. With support from his family of four, Dr. Elst has worked as a journalist and columnist in foreign affairs, mostly freelance, punctuated by stints as an assistant in the Belgian Senate and as a guest professor in two reputed universities in India. His then dissident findings on Ayodhya made him target of cancel culture, but also opened the doors of Hindu assertion of many stalwarts. He has played a pioneering role in the Aryan homeland debate. His PhD work was made available in the form of two books, Decolonizing the Hindu Mind and Who is a Hindu. He has also written on very different themes, altogether 30 books, numerous papers, and contributions to collective research volumes, also in his Dutch mother tongue. Namaste, sir. Uh, Other than him, we have Virag sir with us, Virag Pathpur, Dr. Sanjeev Kerkar, and Professor Vidya Deshpande, who will be contributing to the discussion. Sir, we'll straight away begin with the discussion. So, I'll begin with my first question to you. Today, it is observed that the cultural impact of Hindu Dharma is increasing globally. The presence of Hindus is noticeably increasing around the globe. And at the same time, atrocities and hatred against Hindus is also increasing. So, what perception has resulted in such a negative view towards Hindu Dharma and Hindus? And why, according to you, is the increasing impact of Hindus perceived as a threat by other worldly communities? Or is it even considered that way?
Well, you've given the answer yourself, namely, there is an increasing presence of born Hindus across the world, especially in the center of opinion making, which is the United States. And so there are some centers of Western culture that still harbor a certain hatred for Hinduism, especially the Christian missionaries. In which circle we can, for instance, locate Professor Audrey Truschke. But in general, the hatred against Hinduism in America is mostly the handiwork of born Hindus. You see, when in India people complain about, the West is doing this and that. No, you see, the West is mostly not interested in India. You see, long ago, there was a colonial undertaking that had India as its main colony, but that's long ago, you see, that doesn't operate anymore. And so mostly, certainly in Europe, people are not interested in India. In America, a little bit more, but really, when Americans think about the rest of the world, they think of China as the main competitor. They, and not the White House and so on, but the common people think of the Islamic world as a source of trouble, a nuisance, but they don't think of India. You see, India doesn't make headlines. You know, nothing ever happens in India, or that's at least how the West perceives it. You see, they don't send bombers or terrorists. They have some economic successes, but more gradual, not as spectacular as China at some point. And anyway, you see, economic success is not the problem. You see, some people in India flatter themselves saying, "Oh, the West is afraid of the economic rise of India and so on." That's not how it works. You see, if India becomes richer, it also can buy more from Western producers. So economically, the West is not worried about India's growth. On the contrary. And geopolitically, well, You see, India is a bit too independent, like, for instance, its refusal to join the boycott of Russia at the moment. But, that's what happens, you see. There are so many, allies and partners who do not toe the American line all the way, like during the Iraq War in 2003. France and Germany did not join. And this is, so this is measured. This is not unduly worrying. By contrast, for the Indians in America, they still have a passion about Indian issues, and it is they mainly who supply the passion, the very strong involvement in anti-Hindu struggles. So that's the main thing. You see, I mean, out of a certain patriotism, chauvinism, you see, many Hindus still anachronistically talk about the West is doing this, a Western conspiracy against India, whereas the West is not that involved. It is mostly Indians in the West who provide the firepower for this.
I would like to ask a supplementary question. In India, we are observing a resurgence of assertive Hinduism, Hindutva, with the advent of BJP at the center. A new kind of assertive Hindutva is seen everywhere. You have been into the study of Hinduism, Hindutva in India. How do you analyze this?
Yeah, well, several things at the same time. Let's start at let's say, the far right, or what journalists call that. I wouldn't use that term at all. Let's start with conservative Hinduism, which is not Hindutva. You see, the political Hindu movement, ever since its emergence mainly from Arya Samaj circles, which were very reformist, has also always been predominantly reformist. And so really reactionary Hindus, the type of the Puri Shankaracharya, for example, they lambast the RSS, the Sangh Parivar tendency, because it is anti-caste and anti-traditional. And but so let's take that tendency first. That tendency is not growing, but it is becoming more vocal, or at least it can be heard more thanks to the modern communication technology. So you have groups and even papers online. You see that cost nothing, so anyone can use them. So those circles also. So you can right away get their viewpoint on things. So they're more vocal, but they lose power constantly. Then you have a tendency of, let's say, let's say, pro-Hindu voices. I will not always say Hindu apologists, but so who are outside the Sangh Parivar, and there is a strong growth and an emancipation from Sangh Parivar associations, which I would call like a Hindu ecosystem, also mainly located online. Papers like Op India, like P Gurus, the Jaipur dialogue. So they are an important locus of growth. As for the Sangh Parivar, that has always been there, or for a long time already, I don't know if that is now a factor of growth of Hinduism. You see, in the perception of the outside world, yes. They go on saying, oh, BJP, Hindu fanatic, and so on. But you see, if you look at this closely, it's totally anachronistic. You see, they talk about the BJP as if it is the Jan Sangh founded in 1951 by Shyam Prasad Mukherjee. That was a Hindu party. The Jan Sangh itself, during its history, became ever less Hindu. with people like Nana Deshmukh or Atal Bihari Vajpayee swearing by something they called Gandhian socialism. Then when the party was reconstituted in 1980, even the verbal references to Hinduism disappeared. You see, many people say, oh yeah, the Hindu party is not living up to its Hindu promises, to which BJP people say, correctly, but there are no Hindu promises. Look at our program, it's all vikas, it's all development and so on. Nothing Hindu about it. And this is true, but this is worrying. And so there you see, there is an objective alliance between the BJP as a party and its enemies. You see, both have an interest in making the Hindus believe, making everyone believe that this is a fanatical Hindu party. And so, because you see, the secularists claim to be doing a good job warning people off against this Hindu fanaticism. But in fact, that's what makes Hindus vote for them. You see, they want to feel at home, under the umbrella of a fanatically Hindu party, which the BJP is not. But they have an interest in having all the hostile media spread the story that they are a fanatically Hindu party. This idea of a fanatically Hindu party, by the way, also leads the outside world to misunderstand some fundamental things. Like, there is this idea in the West that Hinduism is caste, wholly caste, and nothing but caste. And therefore, a fanatically Hindu party must be fanatically pro-caste, which is just the opposite of what the Sangh Parivar stands for. Anyway, but so you see, the BJP has been doing a certain amount of things that are favorable to the Hindus, but only indirectly. You see, their Vikas program is by and large a great success. You see, Hinduism is not Hinduism. That's a different topic. India is doing quite well. You see, economically it's really growing, which international economic body again said 2 months ago or so that the last 10 years, about 400 million people in India had been lifted out of the category of the poor into the middle class. That's absolutely spectacular. What an endorsement of the Modi government. And so indirectly that has an effect, because you see the fabled inferiority complex of the Hindus, is partly due to foreign domination for so long, but partly also due to the fact of poverty, which cannot always be blamed on foreign domination. You see, under the British, India was looted and its contribution to the world economy declined enormously, but it declined even faster under Nehru and Indira. And so India became a total byword of extreme poverty. In the West, they thought of it as, you see, the place where Mother Teresa has to, help the lepers from the gutter because these dirty, vicious Hindus, won't care, and so on. And so, you see, that's part of the enormous poverty that India was in, and that did give people a certain inferiority feeling that also encouraged problems like corruption. You see, people try to make money any which way because they were with their back against the wall. So you see, now India is fast growing out of that. That's a very good thing. But so there's nothing particularly Hindu about it. Then there is a second really pro-Hindu effect. It is that everybody outside thinks that there is now a Hindu party in power. And so, out of conformism, out of riding with the tide, they show a more Hindu-friendly face. Like there are many movie stars and so on who have a record of not caring about Hinduism or being actively anti-Hindu, who now show a pro-Hindu face. Or you see The example now for everyone to see is Rahul Gandhi. You see, who now sports, a Janeu, he goes on with all these Hindu, externalities. And yes, you see, once in a while he does an Arati or something really Hindu. So, that is due not to the BJP's doing, but to the reputation of the BJP as a strongly Hindu party. However, and I'll end with this, so far they've not really done anything pro-Hindu. On the contrary, you see, the policy of appeasement of the minorities continues, absolutely. Now, this recent pro-Pasmanda policy, where they are going to support the lower class Muslims. Okay, in itself, well, maybe that's a good policy. Who knows? But you see, I hear them say things like, "Oh yeah, and the Muslims who were not Arab invaders, but the local converts, they converted because they were oppressed by the caste system." Now, that's not true. You see, K.S. Lal, the historian, has written a very good book about where the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes came from. And so he sketches this phenomenon of Hindu conversions to Islam that has nothing to do with fleeing from oppression, but it does have some opportunist component. You see, in many cases, people converted because it was more profitable to convert. And so you have cases of knife point conversion, but far more common was simply the social pressure. It would be an advantage to be a Muslim, to be part of the ruling class. Like, for instance, in trials, if you had some quarrel with your neighbor, both Hindus, then whoever was the first to convert to Islam would automatically win his trial. So, you see, in America, you have the idea that, the minorities are the good guys because the majority has been oppressive to them. Now, this much is, for instance, true, that blacks have been enslaved, brought to America as slaves. Whether the policy of reservations or affirmative action, as they call it there, whether that is the correct policy, the correct way of doing anything about this, that's a policy decision. That's open for debate. But the fact that they were oppressed, now that is there. So any policy you formulate has to take into account that fact. Now, in India, why would you pamper the minorities? Do you have anything to pay for, to compensate? Was there a period ever in Indian history that the religious minorities were oppressed? You see, you could say, and this again is a matter of debate, oh yeah, the scheduled castes were oppressed. We need to do something special for them. Maybe so. But to do this with Christians or Muslims is total nonsense. There have been many centuries when they were oppressing the Hindus. There has never been a period when it was a disadvantage to be a Muslim or a Christian. You see, either under Hindu rule they have been treated well, like everyone, or under their own rule they oppressed the Hindus. So you see, to feel like, we have to pamper the minorities. Come on, you see, that's not neither here nor there. So just now, Mohan Bhagwat said, "Oh, Muslims are safe in India." Well, of course, they always were. You see, the Mopla Muslims. Okay, who are they? Originally they were Arab pagans, just like the Hindus, who settled here, and then when in Arabia Islam became the norm, then more and more Muslims settled there and this became a Muslim community. Hindus never asked them, and in these mosques, what is it that you do there? What is it that is in your book? So they just accepted them. That's what Hinduism does to the minorities. And so, same thing with the Christians. They came as refugees in the 4th century. No questions were asked, they were given asylum, they were integrated in Hindu society, that's it. So you have really nothing to compensate them for. You should just treat them as fellow citizens. No minority concept in a secular state doesn't exist. In a secular state, you only have citizens, equal before the law.
Two thought processes are observed.
Yeah.
One is Hindu being treated as a national identity of the people living in India.
Yeah.
Another Hindu is being equated with a religion like Christianity and Islam. Now,
Yes, exactly.
Bhagavad you have referred to. Bhagavad had said time and again that the DNA of all people
Yeah.
living in India is same.
Yeah, well, okay. I'll answer both points at the same time. You see, it starts with the definition of Hindu. Yeah, who is a Hindu? You see, in Persian, but not in any Indian language, in Persian, it was originally a geographical term meaning India. But then, you see, when the Muslim invaders brought the term into India, when it became an Indian word, it did not mean Indian. It meant an Indian who is a pagan. Initially, who is a non-Muslim, then when they discovered there were also Christians and Jews, categories that they already knew. Okay, you see, they're not those, monotheists either. But so every native Indian, not a convert to Islam or Christianity, is a Hindu. So you see, the whole question, you see, there's so much ink wasted on it. Are Sikhs Hindus, are Buddhist Hindus, are tribal Hindus, and so on. This is automatically covered by this simple definition. This is the historical definition, the original definition of Hindu. Yes, of course they are all Hindus. You see, a rough and ready criterion that answers this is, okay, according to Islam or according to Christianity, same thing, do they go to hell? So you are all going to hell, that's for sure. And according to Muslims, I'm also going to hell. According to Christians, I'm going to heaven. But there too, you are all going to hell. And as for Christian, let me be clear about this. I am not a Christian. You see, I'm an apostate. But you see, the rule in the Catholic Church is that once you're baptized, that guarantees you heaven, and you can't unbaptize yourself. You see, in my country, there are many ex-Catholics who want to do this little ceremony of unbaptizing, but the bishops have told them, well, you go have your little ceremony if you want, but by rules of Catholic theology, you can't unbaptize yourself. A baptism is forever. So therefore, whatever I do, I'm going to heaven. But you need not worry, because you're going to like it in hell. You see, first of all, because of all your sunshine over here and the very peppered food you eat, the heat will not be a problem for you. And then, you see, the sort of landlord in hell is a fellow with a trishul. Okay, so you feel very at home. And then all this fire you should consider as an eternal Agnihotra. So you really like it.
If we go by what you said, West is not interested in Hindus.
Right.
Even Americans are not interested in Hindus. Then why so much of concentration by missionaries in India, especially on tribal belt and Dalits? What is the reason behind? And so much money is invested in that.
Yes, well, you see, that of course dates back to before independence, when Christians really had close collaboration with the British regime, or certainly the Portuguese regime. And so that has remained. Let's say that the center in the West has shifted to America. But so that Christian heartland is still investing in India. Why? Well, because it's easy. You see, to go trying to convert people in Muslim countries is dangerous. Although you have to admit, especially the evangelicals, have a certain bravery. They also have a lot of expertise, accumulated over the centuries, how you go about it. But so they have a mission in Iran. They have a mission in Kashmir. there are quite a few converts to Christianity in Kashmir. So in China, for example, you see this conversion is forbidden by law, yet they claim millions of converts. So, but compared to that, India is far easier. You see, look at the situation, let's say, in the time of the Constituent Assembly. In India, India became independent, and the situation of the mission just continued. In fact, over the years, they saw that it became even better. Because you see, the British didn't like missionary activity, which meant religious quarrels in the population centers. So they shunted the missionaries off to the tribal belts far away, And so then under Nehru and so on, they could flourish like anything. Yet they were very afraid that this wouldn't continue because they saw what was happening at the exact same time in China. There was this civil war between the communists and the nationalists. The communists won. Wherever the communists went, the mission ended. And the missionaries were extremely fortunate if they were only exiled. You see, mostly they were imprisoned, and very, very often they were killed on the spot. And so this could have happened in India. And so with all their propaganda about Hindu nationalists, Hindu fanatics, that's what you would expect. But so the reality is completely different. So in India, they have a field day. So you see, every dollar spent in India has a far bigger return than any dollar spent in Iran. So yeah, of course they come to India. And here they're doing a very successful job, I would say. Punjab is the latest casualty. So yeah, that's why they keep coming here. That's why, of course, people in America like Peter Friedrich or Audrey Truschke, continue to spew hatred against Christianity. So that's a different phenomenon, a different form of anti-Hindu hatred than the modern woke variety.
Since we are talking about Christian missionaries, so and you mentioned earlier that tribals are being converted, they are being targeted, and another there is a hammering of a narrative that the tribal culture, if the tribal cultural practices are more identical to Christianity than to Hindu Dharma. So you are not Hindus, you are Christians, and that is a narrative that missionaries are spreading.
Yes.
So how is, like, people are falling to it, and because the latest news that are coming in from Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, there are unreported events from Northeast as well. So how are we going to tackle this issue? Is there any way to do it?
Yeah, you see, in the long run, and really that's what I'm concerned with. I mean, I don't know very well about how to tackle things for the immediate. Like with Islam, you have all these security issues, all this violence. So there you need, security policies. There sometimes you need the strong arm tactics, which is not my field. And so with Christianity too, what to do for the immediate, I am not very sure. But what you will have to do for the long run, and that will be 100% successful, is to inform the people correctly. Now, this is something that no secularist government, not the BJP either, is ready to countenance. You see, if you teach proper science of religion, then that will immunize people completely against Christianity or Islam. You see, it is like once you found out that the earth is turning around the sun, the heliocentric position, there is no chance that any amount of propaganda will bring you back to geocentrism, to the idea that the sun is turning around the earth. Once you know how it is, well, the simpler, more primitive, more childish version is never going to convince you anymore. So that's what will happen, what will have to happen in the long run. You see, Christianity sometimes advertises itself with, being nice. Like I've seen in Chennai, along the streets, many slogans are put on the wall, quotations from the Bible. Where you get to see the nice face of Christianity, like the story about the adulterous woman who's going to get stoned, and Jesus says, "Okay, you see, those who are without sin cast the first stone." A story which, incidentally, is not in the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel, which was an addition from centuries after Jesus. But that's by the way. But it's authentically in the Gospel, at least the Gospel that we have now. So that's a nice story. Who could be against that? He's magnanimous, and yeah, let's be like that. Yeah, okay, nobody's against that. If Christianity meant being magnanimous, yeah, let's all be Christian. However, that's not Christianity. Christianity means belief in Jesus. Believe that, mankind is fallen in sin, that Jesus has come to deliver us from sin, that to do that he has to die and get resurrected. That's fundamental, as St. Paul says. If there's no resurrection, there's no sense to Christianity. And that he's the Son of God, or God incarnate. He's an avatar. But he's the only avatar, you see, because of course very many sentimental Hindus would say, oh yeah, since we already have Rama and Krishna and Buddha and so on, yeah, let's add Jesus, who cares? Well, you see, that way, Hindus fool themselves that they are appeasing Christians, whereas to Christians this is totally unacceptable. Whether you say, Jesus is junk, or you say Jesus is one of the avatars of Vishnu, it's the same thing. It's unbelief in the real status of Jesus according to Christianity. That they won't accept. But what you will have to make people understand is that, this theology can't hold out. Nothing happened to the degree of sinfulness of mankind when Jesus died and supposedly was resurrected. Or are you aware of anything changing in 33 AD? So then of course the whole idea of a resurrection, what we have is gospel stories, and we also know that these are stories. I mean, people can have done anything to these testimonies, but okay, for what they are worth, these women go to the grave and they see the grave is empty. So what? You see, many things may have happened. Then what happened ultimately to Jesus is that he disappears. In the Acts of the Apostles, it's described how he's taken up to heaven, which means that he does the same thing as what every mortal does. He disappears. You see, what is the difference between a living person and a dead person? A living person you can come across. You see, your likelihood of meeting important people like the president or the pope or so is very small, but at least in principle it's possible. You meet him on the bus or wherever, you might run into him. Whereas a dead person you will never run into. Now this is exactly the case with Jesus. Whereas if he really had gained eternal life, he would be among us. And he isn't. So it's a very... Then, a fact about Christianity that most people don't know. In the time of Jesus, his followers were in the expectation that he would come back, that this would be the end of the world. So, and Jesus says explicitly, before he goes, that I will come back. And some people here in the audience will still be alive when I come back. So that's crucial. Huh? You see, Christianity was not some mystical sect, some sort of Palestinian Vedanta or something. No. It was a very primitive superstition assuming that some miracle would happen, that the end of the world would come, and that Jesus would come back. Now, that didn't happen. It's very simple. Did it happen, yes or no? No, it didn't happen. And so, by the end of the first century, Christians who had been living in expectation had to accept, well, clearly it's not happening. So, what do people do then? You can see it even today in all the cults and so on. When their predictions don't materialize, they do not say, we were wrong, okay, let's drop that. No, they reinterpret their prediction and they continue. And so that's what happened with the beginning Christian sect. And so they accepted that Jesus is not coming back. And then they reinterpreted. They said, yeah, but it's in an afterlife. Then they started inventing heaven and hell, which Jews originally didn't believe in. But so by then, many Greeks had converted. They brought with them the Platonic notion of an afterlife. So then that was instrumentalized in giving some reasonable explanation, getting around the failed prediction about Jesus' comeback. So, people ought to know all this, and I think then they will be immune for Christianity. Similarly with Islam. First of all, you see the idea that the Quran existed in the bosom of God, and then one day God decided to bring it to mankind, send it down to the Prophet. Yeah, that's a nice image. Okay, maybe people can entertain this as some kind of fantasy, but look at the Quran. There is nothing divine about the Quran. There are many linguistic mistakes in it. Why is it in Arabic at all? You see, why is God, so attached to this particular language? Well, because Muhammad was an Arab, of course, and so this book is not from God; it's from Muhammad. It's his tape recorder. And so he spoke in tongues, so to speak, as Christians say. He had these visions or hallucinations, some will say. And so he then dictated them, and the secretary of the company that he worked for, his wife's company, Khadija's company, wrote it down, and then everything was put together, and that became the Quran. Now, and you see, contents-wise, there's all kinds of things you can say about the Quran. Like it testifies to some things in the life of the Prophet that are not particularly praiseworthy, like Nupur Sharma indicated in her famous TV debate. And that's entirely authentic. That's not her insult of the Prophet or something. No, that's what Islamic sources say about the Prophet. That's what Zakir Nayak says about the Prophet. So, they're all very interesting. And yes, there are some nice things in the Quran and in the life of Muhammad. Like, for example, Muhammad was deemed to be very trustworthy. He was a very solid person. And so when he fled to Medina, it took some days for his relatives to return all the goods that friends and so on had deposited there, because they considered him so reliable. So yeah, that may be a very positive trait of the Prophet. Or I'll name something else. Several times in the Quran, it is argued that you should not deprive children of their inheritance. This is something that had happened to him personally. You see, his father died before he was born, and his mother died when he was 6. So he was an orphan. He was cared for by an uncle or family members, and so they cared for him, but at the same time they took his inheritance. And so you see, he knew that this is a fairly painful experience, so he warns against that. Now, that's a great advice. Yes, you see, don't deprive children of their inheritance. Which, incidentally, of course, you can apply to the situation of Hindus here. You see, I don't want to see any of you deprived of your inheritance, your inheritance being Sanatana Dharma. So stay true to your inheritance, you see. Don't deprive the Hindus of their inheritance by converting them. Really. So the word of Muhammad should be followed. As Narendra Modi has said recently, you see, follow the example of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. So in some respects, I would not follow it. But here, yes, of course. So there are also good things in the Quran. However, not to the extent that you have a reason to convert to Islam. And so if people want to follow the Prophet and so on, I wouldn't interfere. But it's certainly no reason to take to that religion, to convert to.
Right. So, globally, as well as in India, we see illegal migration of Muslims that is growing as a serious concern, leading to mass acts of violence as well.
Yes.
So, this is resulting in a demographic shift as well. What is the root cause of this problem according to you, and how is it related to the core thought of Islam? Do you think this too, under the title of displacement, is another attempt of jihad?
Well, the Prophet himself advises his people to be as numerous as possible. He's not fussy about this. Like the Old Testament, you see, the Israelite religion is also very much oriented to procreation. And they're very fussy about it. You see, in principle, every sexual act that does not lead to procreation is forbidden. And, you know, it's very central, like, for instance, to celebrate the Sabbath, the holy day every week, you're supposed to have intercourse with your partner. And so you celebrate God by procreating. Yeah. And so Islam goes on in that fashion. In Christianity, you have already more an accent on asceticism, celibacy, and so on. There it's not, you know, full steam procreation. In Islam it is. But they're not so fussy. You see, let's say deviant sexual practices won't keep people from procreating. So now there are a number of institutions in Islam that strongly encourage procreation. Like, for example, in the case of divorce. Okay, what happens now in the modern West? Okay, there's divorce. The wife has 2 children to care for. Now she doesn't have a husband anymore, so it's a full-time job. She is less available on the marriage market. She's busy with those 2 children. Most men are not interested in raising somebody else's child. So she'll make a downward move on the marriage market, and so on. And, you know, often it just doesn't happen anymore. She doesn't remarry. There are no more children. Now, what happens in Islam? The children are automatically given to the husband, right? And so the husband has every reason to remarry because somebody has to take care of the children. Now, usually in the extended family, this is cared for, but at any rate, you see, he's totally free and, in fact, encouraged to remarry and to start a new family. The woman, you see, if she has any desire for children, she's deprived of her own children, so she has every reason to remarry and restart, you know, a new family. So there is all-round encouragement of procreation, which you have very much less in other societies, like in Hindu society until the 20th century, widows were not supposed to remarry. And you had child marriage, so often, you see, girls were betrothed almost since birth. And so their husband, you see, in, let's say, his teenage years, in some adventure that young people undertake, he dies. And so she's a widow, and she can't have children for the rest of her life. See, so you see, these institutions in Hinduism are less conducive to procreation. So in Islam, there's an explicit commandment by Muhammad to be demographically successful, and there are institutions that encourages this demographic success. Now, you see, today it's not that dramatic in the sense that Muslim families are also becoming smaller, but still larger than the corresponding Hindu families or the corresponding European families. So, upon present trends, it is very certain that both in Europe and in India, you're going to have a Muslim majority by the end of the century. That's not some Hindutva paranoia or something. You just calculate from present trends. However, I personally don't think that that's going to happen. Not because of any clever strategy that Hindus have, because I can tell you they don't, but because of an evolution that is taking place within Muslim society. Last week I was in Kerala. There you have, well, already thousands of openly, ex-Muslims who say, you see, they broke with Islam and for this and this and this reason. And you have websites where all these reasons are explained in Malayalam, in English, any language you have these days. So, usually this is available, this is a trend that exists. In India, perhaps less than, for instance, in the Arab countries, because here they are, as a community, in a situation of polarization with the Hindus, which means that they feel like, you see, they don't want to desert a community in this polarized situation, whereas in the Arab countries that plays much less. There, of course, you have a different problem, which is that, well, Muslim society is all around you. It takes courage to go against that. So very many ex-Muslims, are ex-Muslim under the radar. They don't declare publicly that they're ex-Muslim. But so the trend is there, and it will reach a critical mass where these people will come out. The same thing I see in Europe. Um, many Muslims quit the faith to different degrees depending on their relation with their families and so on. In the Belgian parliament, there are a number of ex-Muslims, including at least 3 of them who openly declare, so not coincidentally 3 women, one born in Cameroon, one born in Iran, one born in Turkey. And so they're very explicitly ex-Muslim. And of course they support causes like, for instance, the ending of female circumcision. They support the present women's opposition in Iran, and so on. So you see that tendency is strong. And so it's less conspicuous in India, but it certainly also exists in India. And so that's why I don't think that Muslims are going to take over this country.
Similar movement is going on in the US also.
Yeah,
Yes,
of course.
people are detaching themselves from Christianity.
Yes.
Christian
Yeah, but that's a different thing. But it also explains why I am very sensitive to this trend, because I've seen it happen in my country with Roman Catholicism. You see, when I was a kid, everybody went to church, and in fact, I must have been 18 years old before I actually interacted consciously with someone who was not a member of the Catholic community. So these worlds were kept separate, and the Catholic community was everywhere, was very large. Today, it's a small minority. And so many churches are closing down, are either being demolished, or the church, for instance, where I was in the church choir, is now the swimming pool of the school next door. Some churches become restaurants, so you have all the nice windows and paintings and so on. They remain there. They form a nice background so that the restaurant can raise the price, and those things happen. Some even become mosques. But so you see that implosion of Christianity in Europe is very much there. It's only a few countries like Poland are holding out, but even there's a decline. In America, same story. They have held out far longer than Europe, but now also a decline has started. And so, because of that decline, um, I see many similar things happen now in the Muslim world. Like for instance, you must have heard about Prince Salman of Saudi Arabia, who has introduced certain reforms. Like women are no longer forbidden from driving a car. And so the spin put upon it by Muslims is, yeah, you see, these are certain concessions that are needed, but meanwhile he's upholding Islam. Now, I don't know, I cannot look into his mind. I don't know what he really thinks. But you see, it makes me think of like the 60s when the church in Belgium made all kinds of concessions, made it far less strenuous to be a Catholic. But you see, their relaxing their rules was simply part of a process that they soon lost control of. And so people were starting to leave the church. And then an important tilting point is when the conformists see that the wind is changing. You see, in the past, many people were not too serious about their religion, but since everybody went to church, they also went to church. Now, at some point, they saw that so many people were not going to church anymore that just to be with the majority, they also ceased going to church. Right? And so I think that is going to happen in the Muslim world in the not too distant future. Then another element that helps it is that there is the progress of scholarship. Namely, you see, just as Bible scholarship, ever since Spinoza in the 17th century, is deconstructing the belief in, you see, the traditional account of the life of Jesus. This is also happening in Islam. Like, there is the very important German revisionist school that shows, you see, that there are all kinds of things wrong with the traditional narrative of how Islam came about. You see, they say that actually it starts as a particular heresy of Christianity, so-called non-Trinitarian Christianity, where they don't believe that God has incarnated as Jesus. They believe God is something completely different. There's nothing human you can say about him. So he has no father and he also has no son. And so you see, that gets radicalized into Islam. The Quran is full of the person of Jesus. And some typically Christian beliefs about Jesus, like that he was born from a virgin, is also there in the Quran. But the idea that he was God or something, lam yalid wa lam yulad. He has not been created and has not created. Um, so, that's the break with Christianity. That's where Islam really becomes a religion of its own. But so originally it starts with Christian prayers and so on in Aramaic. And those you find back in the shortest, which happens to be the last chapters of the Quran, which, according to some scholars working in Germany, can be shown to be clumsy Arabic translations from the Aramaic. And so then, of course, it starts to take on a life of its own. For example, the famous story about the 72 Houris waiting for the jihad warriors up in heaven. So this Christoph Luxemburg, which is a pseudonym of a Lebanese scholar, because it's dangerous to say these things. But so he claims to show that that particular passage of the Quran is a clumsy translation from the Aramaic, where it is said in a typical Christian imagery of heaven, that you see there you are surrounded by plants and growth and so on, including white grapes. And so these white grapes have been mistranslated into these white, beautiful, desirable women. Then in other passages of the Quran, there it has been accepted as an Islamic doctrine, and there's really talk about women in heaven and so on. But so that's based on a mistranslation from the Aramaic. So, I mean, all these things together. Oh, and by the way, it's not that these scholarly findings are readily accepted by the scholarly world. I was at the very large Orientalist conference in Berlin this September, and so I noticed, among all the books they had there on offer, this German revisionist school was not represented. There was only one other book where in the introduction there were a few sentences disparaging the school. That's the only way you would know at this entire conference that this revisionism exists. So you see, academia in the West is very pro-Islamic and is trying to keep this down. But you see, ultimately, history shows that this doesn't work. The establishment of its day also tried to keep heliocentrism with Galilei down, and it won through anyway. So this also is going to win through. Like there is another important form of revisionism, thanks to the Canadian archaeologist Dan Gibson, that shows that Mecca did not exist at the time of the Prophet. You see, actually these things happened in the city of Petra in Jordan, of which all the geographical details correspond to the description of Mecca in the Quran. And so what happened was that later on in the Caliphate of Damascus, the Umayyad Caliphate, there was a civil war, and so one of the rebels seized the city of Petra, took the black stone, broke the Kaaba, took the black stone, and abducted the black stone as far away from Damascus as possible to Arabia. And there, in some place in the desert, created a new city. First, a fortification useful in that civil war. He got beaten anyway, but the black stone remained there, mainly because it was supported by a party located in Baghdad or that area, which later became the Abbasid Caliphate. But so, what Muslims go on pilgrimage to is a clumsy imitation of the original Mecca. Like, for instance, they have to commute, a few times between two hills. Now, in Mecca, you don't really have hills. You see, it's a very, flatter to call them hills. But they imitate two existing hills with a river in between, which exists in Petra, and so on. I mean, so you see, the basis of Islam is very brittle. And so you see that knowledge is going to percolate, and now it's very easy. You see, back in the old days, if you would bring a dissident book, say you are a teenager, you bring this dissident book into your home, you have to be very careful that your father doesn't discover it, and so on. It's adventures nowadays. It's easy. You put on the YouTube video where it's all explained. And if your father comes in, you put it off again. So you see, these ideas are going to spread. There's nothing to stop it. And so therefore, I do not expect Islam to take over India in the long run.
There is something I want to.
Yes.
Why is it that the Hindus in America, as you say, are so much anti-Hindus and their activities?
Well, they are. I mean, many Hindus are like that in India.
Yes, they are.
But so when they go to America, they find instruments at their disposal which they don't have in India. You see, if you have Harvard at your disposal, with its, stamp of scientific status and so on, you can, your voice is heard a lot better than if you say the same thing even from JNU or Ashoka University or so. So there's power attached to it. and there's money power attached to it, Silicon Valley and so on. And like these, places like Twitter and so on, where until recently born Hindus, you see, were, pushing it in a woke direction, censoring every pro-Hindu voice, every conservative voice in general, but specifically anything pro-Hindu. That has now changed thanks to Elon Musk. But overall, you see this tendency persists. So you see, these Hindus are already what they were in India, but in America they get far more opportunity to attach power to it.
Another thing, uh, even if the West is not particularly interested in India as a Hindu country, but there is another tendency that they somehow tend to care or pander the Islamic countries.
Yes.
And that actually, even without any violation about Hindus, but this will tilt the balance. It will go against the interests of whatever of the Hindus. How do you look at this?
Well, you see, the favoring of Islam has a few interesting causes. One is that the leftist media used to be up in arms against Christianity when Christianity was still a power. And so that attitude has continued. And so back then that meant favoring Islam as against Christianity, and out of inertia, that tendency is still there. Second thing is that, they've always been anti-rightist. The rightists were pro-Islam until sometime in the 90s, because Islam is a martial religion, because this is a natalist religion, so they thought this is what the West needs, to be more fighting and to have more children. In many cases, it was also for the anti-Jewish reason. Many people were in favor of the Palestinians against Israel and so on the right. And so what changed is, especially in the 90s, rightist parties became aware that there was a groundswell among the common people of anti-Islamic feelings, because they were feeling the heat. It's in the popular neighborhoods in the West, you see, the elite didn't feel it, but the ordinary people felt it, that you had things like, for instance, the Pakistani grooming gangs in England. They don't hit the rich, they hit the poor. And so, you see, there was this groundswell of anti-Islamic feeling. And so gradually the rightist parties dropped the concern with, Second World War and so on, and started orienting themselves to the realities that, have recently emerged. So the rightist parties being against Islam automatically meant the leftist parties being in favor of Islam. So that's mostly in the 90s that this change took place. When you see in 1988-89, the Salman Rushdie affair, the banning of this Satanic Verses book, and the death sentence against the writer Salman Rushdie, at that time, most leftist intellectuals were on the side of Rushdie and against the Ayatollahs, whom they identified, like with the church establishment and so on. They were automatically the bad guys. Today it would be the reverse. You see, today all kinds of retrograde tendencies in Islam are justified by the Western left, either by not drawing attention to the natural tension between Islamic conservatism and their own progressive wake values, or by simply lying about it. Like a few years ago, there was an Islamic attack making 100 or so victims to a homosexual bar in Orlando in the United States. And so the gay movement try to say afterwards, oh yeah, it's because of the Republicans, the conservative Christians that this thing happened. No, it was because of Islam that this thing happened, but they don't want to upset the coalition between their own tendency and Islam by saying the truth about this. So yeah, there is an enormous effort by censorship or by plain lies to not upset that coalition. So that coalition is at the moment going very strong.
Is there any absolutely banal and mundane factor like oil?
Like?
Oil that the Middle East has?
Well, you see, that strengthens certain tendencies, but that's not the base of it. You see, I mean, some vulgar people say, oh, I know the true story. It's all about oil, follow the money. Now, you see, that's not doing justice to what human beings are. You see, many human beings are guided by other concerns than just lucre. Osama bin Laden, he was a billionaire. He needed nothing. He could have spent his life in his palace in Yemen or wherever in Sudan and enjoying life and having more wives and more children and so on. Now he had only 5 and 30 children. What how ordinary. But so, no, you see, he gave that all up. You see, he went to live in a cave in Afghanistan. He used his billions to finance jihad. So, you see, people do things not for the money, but on the contrary, spending their money. And so, you see, this is a reality. So, this oil concern, yes, that's there. And for some people, that will be the decisive concern. But really, you see, all it does is it fortifies the existing desire to spread Islam. And yes, when the oil money runs out, which inevitably will happen, then they can't finance the building of mosques in other countries anymore and spreading Islamic literature and so on. So then they'll have to be a bit more modest. But so the tendency to do everything possible for Islam will still remain, as long as Islam remains.
So, as yes,
I'm
ma'am.
sorry.
Yes, ma'am. Please.
There are two set of contradictions amusing there. On one hand, people are being skeptical in Europe about their own faith,
Yeah.
and they want to follow some other faith, though maybe openly they don't come out. And on the other hand, still missionaries are being sent to the countries where people can be converted. This is one example.
Mhm.
And the other one, as you said, your Western America, they are not interested in India. But the impression in India is that whenever there is a development project, some important project, it is being protested, it is being contested, and the money comes from outside India.
Yeah.
So,
Yes, well, you see, the missionary establishment and the general population are two different things. And so, in the not too distant past, the missionary establishment was carried by the common people. Like, I mean, I come from a country that was, proportionally very rich in sending missionaries. Like, for instance, a family friend of mine, Herman Raschar, was stoned to death by the tribals, by his own converts, in Chotanagpur in 1964, because he tried to protect a local mosque at which tribals were going, Christian tribals, because in neighboring East Pakistan, tribals had been massacred by the Muslims. And okay, so that was genuinely heroic of his. It's genuinely showing a concern to prevent bloodshed and so on. Very good. Now, at that time, you see, of course, he was honored in India. Jawaharlal Nehru brought his family over to thank them and so on. But he was also very popular in Belgium. And so, you see, everybody felt concern and felt solidarity and thought, you see, the mission in India is a good thing. even non-believers thought, well, it brings civilization and so on to these backward people, and so that was the situation back then. Nowadays, nobody cares about the mission anymore. But there is still a missionary establishment, and those people that they still have, you see, are generous, you see, are involved and give a lot of money that they can spend on the mission here. In America, they're 2 generations behind. There, the decline in Christianity is only just beginning. So there, they still have a rather great support base. But so, as long as this missionary establishment is there, they're going to keep on supporting the mission here to the extent possible. However, Hindus make a mistake when they keep on identifying the mission with America. You see, most of the missionaries today are Indians or other Asians, Filipinos or Koreans or so. Like a few years ago in Afghanistan, there was a case of a number of missionaries that had been kidnapped by the Taliban, and so their government, had to go through negotiations, possibly also paying a ransom price. It was said, and so they went through a lot of trouble to get these people free. And the very first thing they said when they were free was that we apologize to our government, to our people, for all the trouble we've caused them, which is a very Oriental thing to say, because what were they? No, they were not Americans, they were not Germans or so, they were Koreans, right? And so you have this completely anachronistic view of, you see, the Christian mission is a form of imperialism. During the Cold War, this still existed, that the missions were used by the CIA as a sort of a pawn, as a channel of influence. In the colonial period, it's even more explicit. Like, for instance, the French Third Republic between 1871 and 1940 was militantly secularist, militantly anti-Catholic, yet they supported the Catholic mission in places like Vietnam, in their colonies, because they thought, you see, this turning away from Buddhism to Catholicism will make them more loyal to France. So in those days, this really existed, the connection between the mission and imperialism. But today, you see, that's over. The church has its own agenda. Back then in the Roman Empire, they had no colonies, they had no state power, the first 2-3 centuries, but they did mission anyway. Then they had state power, they continued the mission. Then in some places they lost power, like they went under Islam or whatever, and they continued to the extent possible their, ideal of converting all of mankind. And then comes the colonial period, so, they're grateful to God for giving them this great opportunity. But then when colonialism is over, they also adapted to the new situation. That's where you get things like, you see, the inculturation policy. Inculturation policy started in Greece, when they spread from Palestine to Greece, to the Roman Empire. They adapt locally, like they abolish the requirement of following the Jewish law. And so they adapt to paganism to some extent, but they keep on bringing their message and converting more and more people. And so they take over a lot of the culture, you see, that they find before them. That's why, for instance, in Catholic theology, you have many thought categories taken from Greek philosophy. And so here now they're doing the same thing. They are adapting Vedanta and so on to Christian theology. And they're dressing up in orange and so on. They're making their churches look like temples. So you see, that's an adaptation to the new situation. It's no longer very wise to try to impose the culture they come from. So they take the local culture as long as they can insert Christianity into it.
So, as you mentioned earlier, there has been a misinterpretation of regarding Islam or regarding Christianity. So, may it be on purpose or not, by mistake, but there has been a misinterpretation regarding cultures, and the problems it has created. We are dealing with it today. A similar thing has happened with Hindu Dharma as well. So, I have two questions regarding history. So, what is the role of Orientalists in the distorted narration of Indian history? And are there any historians or organizations that have been influential in creating an anti Hindu narrative through distorted history? And the second question is, when we talk about the Indian freedom struggle, we see the Indian National Congress forming in 1885. And then later in 1925, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangha, RSS, is formed. So both the organizations claim that their aim was Indian freedom from oppressive British rule. So, however, if there was already an organization formed in 1885, what sentiments and thoughts resulted in the formation of RSS, and how did the RSS contribute in the freedom struggle? So,
Yes. Well, let's start with the first question. Yes. So let's thank God, or let's thank Vishnu, or Jupiter, or whoever, for Orientalism. Orientalism is great. I am an Orientalist. Okay? And the Berlin conference that I talked about earlier is called the Deutsche Orientalistentage, the German Orientalist Conference. You see, what is Orientalism? It's simply the study of Eastern cultures. You see, in the Renaissance, 16th century, you had a focus on studying classical culture, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Erasmus, the philosopher after whom the building was named in which I have studied, he founded in my own hometown the three languages college, where they studied Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. So in the 19th century, this is expanded, and so new languages are being discovered. So from then on, you also get people focusing on Chinese, Japanese, Sanskrit, Persian, and so that's a very good thing. You see, that's more knowledge, broadening the horizon. I'm all for it. And so in 1979, Edward Said made some headlines by problematizing Orientalism. He was a very literal case of a dhimmi. He was a Palestinian Christian, and so a Christian who had, for more than 1,000 years, lived under Islamic domination and tried to survive by flattering Islam. And flattering Islam is what he did. It was his whole career, you see, all his books. And so in this case, you see, he tries to show every possible criticism, every enlightened study of Islam as part of some colonial conspiracy. His book contains many factual errors. Like, for instance, he completely ignores the central role in Orientalism of the German-speaking world, which is not only the German-speaking countries. At that time, German was the dominant academic language, so many Hungarians, Russians, and so on also used it. And so that part of the world had no colonial interest in India. You see, they studied India as a foreign culture which interested them, which they thought was really worth studying, but there was no part of some colonial conspiracy. Then, even in the colonial countries, you see, the colonial administrators realized that many of these Orientalists were untrustworthy because they had a tendency to go native. You see, I can show you, having studied Orientalism, that in every Oriental department, in every university in the West, you have at least one student who totally identifies with the culture he's studying. You see, who who reorganizes his student room in a Japanese fashion or an Arabic fashion or whatever. And so, in the course of their career, this is even more pronounced. I see when people closely study one particular foreign culture, they start to identify with it. Like there are things about that culture that in the West evoke, revulsion or attenuate criticism, and they, because they know the culture, will start to defend this. They will point out, yeah, but there are certain factors that you don't understand that make this phenomenon much less irrational than you think. And so the colonial administrators knew, you see, some of these Orientalists are pro-Oriental rather than pro-colonial. So all that, you see, is not taken care of. Then anyway, you see, when he talks about Orientalism, he doesn't talk about Japan or India or whatever. He talks about the Muslim world. And the whole object of his study is to, make the Muslim world look better. And another important historical mistake is that the colonial period was not all that negative for Islam. Like in Indonesia, Dutch colony, the Dutch authorities very much promoted Islam. You see all these funny religions, local, tribal, Hindu or so, they were hard to handle. Whereas Islam was something simple you could deal with. So all in all, they were very favorable to Islam. The very first book ever printed in Afrikaans, which is the South African variety of Dutch, was a translation of the Quran. So, you have the same thing, of course, in British India. You see, the British, of course, were first of all here to serve their own interests. But, this changed a little bit over the years. Like in 1857, they identified the mutiny with the Mughal Empire. And, the Mughal Emperor, the last Mughal Emperor, was made the figurehead of this rebellion. So at that time, they very much distrusted Islam. But then when the freedom movement started, they distrusted Hinduism because the freedom movement was a Hindu phenomenon. And then they founded or patronized the Muslim League, 1906. And then they were rather favorable to Islam. And they pursued policies that favored the Muslim community, like the creation of separate electorates. So, from a Muslim viewpoint, colonialism was not altogether negative. Again, you see that's something that Edward Said doesn't account for. But so, even though he wrote his stuff in favor of Islam, many Hindus, many silly Hindus have taken this over, have also started treating Orientalists like a dirty word. And, okay, that tendency is there. I know that I'm only one person, but I go against it. So long live Orientalism. Then your second question. Okay, so you have the freedom movement starting in 1885. Now, initially, that was not the freedom movement. You see, the Congress was a British initiative essentially, which aimed at advocating the interests of the natives, but there was no talk of independence yet. And then later on, they started talking about dominion status, which is the same thing that within the British Empire was given to Canada, to Australia. And so, you see there, at least they considered the Indians as a grown-up community. You see, in African countries, they didn't consider this at all. They thought they're too primitive. So India was also too primitive. Like, for instance, the censorship law 295A, which forbids the so-called insulting of religion, effectively the criticism of religion, effectively the criticism of Islam, because it's only Islam that they had trouble with. If you criticized Islam, you could count on some murder happening. Whereas if you criticized Hinduism, all that would happen was a counter-criticism written from the Hindu viewpoint. Like, in fact, let's focus for a moment on this law. You see, this was voted in 1927, just after two very prominent murders of Swami Shraddhananda, one of the co-founders of the Hindu Mahasabha, a great reformist, anti-caste and so on, but also a great promoter of the reconversion of Muslims to Hinduism. And so it's because of the reconversion of one particular Muslim family that other family members came after him and murdered him. And then shortly thereafter, the murder of Rajpal, the publisher of a book called Rangila Rasul. Now, what is this book? There first was a Muslim writing against Sita, Rama's wife Sita, saying that she was a prostitute and saying all kinds of scurrilous things about her. And what do Hindus do? Did they go after the writer and murder him? No, that's not the Hindu way of doing things. They wrote a counter book. They said, okay, if you can insult Sita, well, we can do the same thing with Muhammad. Which is just like in the debate between this Taslim Rehmani and Nupur Sharma. They're exactly the same. He insulted Shiva, and so she said, well, if you do that, let's say something about Muhammad. And she didn't insult Muhammad, she just quoted what Islam itself says about Muhammad. Anyway, but so this is what happened here. So he scoured the Muslim source texts for details about the sex life of Muhammad. Rangila Rasul literally means the colorful prophet, but so that's a sort of polite way of saying the sex-crazed prophet. And so you see, what he said was nothing that he invented. It was there in the Islamic source text. Nevertheless, Muslims took it as an insult. What did they do? Did they write a counter book, as Hindus do? No, they murdered him. And so the British said, let's stop these endless murders. And the only way to do it is to prevent criticism of Islam. Now, having a sort of secular regime, they couldn't say, okay, let's prohibit criticism of Islam. They had to say, let's prohibit criticism of religions. But of course, what they meant actually was criticism of Islam. And so, of course, among the British circles, some said, but why do this? In England, criticism of religion is perfectly allowed. There are vivid debates between Anglicans and Catholics, and there were already atheists like Edward Gibbon, like the philosopher Hume, and so on. And then there were all kinds of Protestant minorities, Methodists, and so on. There were plenty of religious debates. Why not allow this in our colony? Well, they said, yeah, but you see, Hindus are like, or Muslims, Indians are like grown-up children, They can't handle this serious stuff, religious debate. They're so emotional. You see, once they hear an insult, they become uncontrollable. They become violent. So we have to stop this. Okay. So, where were we? Yes, founding of the RSS, that's around the same time, 1925. Founding of the Hindu Mahasabha is 1922, at least the definitive, because it has several false starts, starting in 1906. Okay, so you see, the Hindu movement was organized. It was very much directed to Indian independence, whatever the communists today say. In fact, the Hindu Mahasabha started as a lobby group inside the Congress movement. So if you're willing to say Congress did not want independence, then you could say the same thing about the Hindu Mahasabha. But if Congress has achieved independence, as the Congressites claim, then you have to admit that the Hindu Mahasabha was very much part of the freedom movement. Same thing for the RSS. It started with Dr. Hedgewar, who had been inside the circles of the Bengal revolutionaries. And so then he thought of a different manner of achieving, of preparing Hindus for independence. But at any rate, you see, of course, the goal of independence was very, very alive for them. Okay, so they started this. Then what? I mean, then they achieved independence. Now, it was not their doing. The Congress, of course, myth is that it was Mahatma Gandhi's doing. Whereas, you see, if you look at Mahatma Gandhi's career, first of all, he was a British loyalist. He fought in 3 wars on the British side. In the First World War, he recruited for the British war effort. So you see, in my country, you know, Flanders fields, okay, you have all these graveyards of the Commonwealth, and so many of them have these Sikh signs, or why did they die there? Because it was a very useless war where human beings by the millions were sacrificed in totally useless offensives. You know, why were they there? Well, because Gandhi had told them to go there. Because you see, they had to serve the British interests. So then, yeah, he was in favor of dominion status after Tilak had already, Balagangadhara Tilak had already asserted, you know, full independence as their natural birthright. You see, he was a bit behind. You know, like Annie Besant, you know, she was still old school dominion status within the British Empire. And so it is the groundswell within Congress that in 1925 brought the Purna Swaraj resolution for full independence. And then you see Gandhi jumped onto that bandwagon. There was a mass agitation. Many people quit their jobs or their study places, made great personal sacrifices, and then at the end of it all, no independence. Gandhi made a very weak compromise with the viceroy, and so independence was out of sight. Then came the Government of India Act, which, you know, certainly autonomy for India, but still entirely part of the British Empire. And then came the Quit India movement, where, of course, Gandhi did take a leadership role. It was based on the faulty assumption that the Japanese were soon going to conquer India, and that therefore they had to be out of the losing camp of the British. Therefore, they quickly needed the British to leave. Which of course wasn't correct. And anyway, the movement failed completely. And so the effect, the net political effect, was that Congress was out of the equation for as long as the war lasted, which gave Jinnah the chance of building up the position of the Muslim League, so that by 1945 they were ready to do their partition. And so Gandhi was a man of the past. Then you see came the partition. Gandhi promised all the Hindus in Lahore and in Dhaka and so on, oh, you see, partition only over my dead body. But then he accepted partition. And so it's not Gandhi who died in the partition, it's these Hindus in Lahore who died. And, you know, maybe politics is a bit of a dirty game, but the several millions that died in partition, how can you be a hero of ahimsa, of non-violence, if this is the result of your policies? So it's very good to go against that. However, what happened then was something that the Hindu movement didn't count on. So many Hindus were very angry at the fact of partition. And so they did certain things that were not so intelligent. And here I mean the murder of the Mahatma. Okay? Now we're in Pune here, where the family of Godse still lives. Maybe some people are fans of his act, but you see, having researched it, having written a book about it, the only book in the world so far that details the motives behind the murder. I mean, there are a few about the intrigue of the murder. There are thousands of books about Mahatma Gandhi saying this, the same, you know, sycophantic praise of the Mahatma. But so the only one about the motives behind the murder tries to do justice to the motives that animated the murderer Nathuram Godse. However, my conclusion about it is that he basically was mistaken. You see, there is a moral argument against taking people's lives, of course, but there is also an enormous strategic argument why he shouldn't have done this. Namely, the Hindu movement had the wind in the sails after partition. You see, it then had transpired very clearly that the Gandhian approach was the wrong one. It didn't succeed. You see, he said, a satyagraha, he cannot fail, and it turned out that, he failed completely. Vis-a-vis Jinnah, he was nowhere in the picture. He didn't even try to put pressure on Jinnah. So, you see, as an alternative to that, the Hindu movement was there. And so it was ready for a career. It could have come to power in spite of the omnipresence of Congress. It could have come to power by 1960 thereabouts. And that was completely blown away by only one act, which is the murder of the Mahatma, which was also followed by a great pogrom of Maharashtrian Brahmins, entirely comparable to the murder of the Sikhs in 1984. You see, this was not some, in foreign media they tried to present it as some revenge by Hindus. Now, of course, the Khalistanis had murdered tens of thousands of Hindus in West Punjab, in East Punjab, in the preceding years. But Hindus never took revenge for this. Okay? This was a revenge by Congress secularists against the community of whom one had murdered their leader. And so the same thing happened in Maharashtra in, February 1948, where the same Congress secularists, the Gandhians, the Ahimsa people, you see, took bloody revenge on the community from which the murderer had emerged. I don't know about the death toll. You see, Bharati Agarwal says 8,000. I have no idea. It's also difficult to reconstruct an accurate figure because no doubt the police at that time has destroyed the records. You see, under instruction from the Congress government. So it's difficult to, I hear that Vikram Sampath and other serious historians have come forward to do the research. Let's find out. So I'm not going to make a guess about the death toll. It was quite serious. But you see, the death toll is only the immediate effect. There's a far bigger long-term effect. So the Hindu movement was stopped, all the people were arrested, all their stock of books and so on was taken over. And so they had a very difficult time rebuilding afterwards. And rebuilding at a far lower level than they had been at before. So yes, you see, Golwalkar was very dynamic in creating many new front organizations, a Hindutva trade union, a Hindutva student organization, and so on. But their political effect had become much less than it could have been had the murder not happened. So you see, rather than coming to power by 1960, it was already a great success that in coalition with the Swatantra Party, which was yet a different sort of rightist party, they could become a serious opposition by the late 1960s. But so they were not in power, they were far from power, and what happened then was that Indira made an alliance with the communists, that you see the whole cultural and educational policy was taken over by the communists, was turned very anti-Hindu. And against all this, you see, the Hindu movement couldn't do anything. They were in the opposition, they were stuck there. So, all this would have been different, but the main effect, an effect that is still with us today, is that the Hindu movement not only became weaker than it should have been, it became much less Hindu than it should have been. And so you see here, I'm sorry to say this in front of a public that which many belong to the Hindutva camp, but you see the resulting party, the Jan Sangh that became the BJP, and the RSS itself have over the years become ever less and less and less and less Hindu. Let's go over the history of the Jan Sangh. It's very much a Hindu party when it starts, 1951, with Shyam Prasad Mukherjee, who died in 1953. From then on, it is downhill all the way. In 1964, Deen Dayal Upadhyay, party president, came up with a series of lectures that were bundled in an ideological statement, integral humanism. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Here and there, it's a bit humdrum, but on the whole, it's a very good thing. And the thing is that nobody can be against that. You see, who would not be in integral humanism? Who would say no, humanism is bad, integral, not bad? No, you see, everybody accepts that. Now, that's why no book about the Hindutva movement, or very, very few, even mention it. You see, in books about the Hindu movement, the BJP is depicted as a fanatical Hindu party and so on, that the party ideology is called integral humanism. That is the ideology in which all party members get a training. That's totally passed over in silence. Why? Because it's too innocent. If you want to demonize this party, you have to act as if there's something else, Hindu fascism or something. And so, okay, now, so I am rather in favor of this ideology, integral humanism. However, its great use at that time, the reason why leftists like Atal Bihari Vajpayee or Nanaji Deshmukh welcomed it, is that it did not contain the word Hindu. Now, if you study its contents, you could say, well, it's a modern secular formulation of what really is Hindu Dharma. So there is still a Hindu element in it, but it's not explicit. You see, Hinduism is pushed into the background step by step. Then you see those two that I mentioned came up with something they called Gandhian socialism. And so when the party was first merged into the Janata Party, 1977, and then was reconstituted as the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP in 1980, you see, there was an actual discussion, okay, what is going to be the party ideology? Is it going to be integral humanism or Gandhian socialism? And so the result, which in fact testifies to the lack of ideological seriousness of the BJP, is that, yeah, it's integral humanism, but on the understanding that Gandhian socialism and integral humanism are the same thing. So we don't have to debate because there is nothing to debate. Okay, well, anyway, you see what happens in the reconstitution of this party is that every reference to Hinduism disappears. And so from then on, really, it's a secular party, even though the press continues to maintain a fanatical Hindu party. And so it goes on like that. You get the Vajpayee government, which doesn't do anything pro-Hindu. There's only Murli Manohar Joshi's attempt to rewrite the textbooks, which was very necessary, but for which he was not prepared at all. It was very clumsy, and when Congress came to power, they immediately shelved the new textbooks. And so Vajpayee did nothing of the sort. At the end of his government, some voices in the BJP leadership ranks said, well, now we really have to do something Hindu, just for the elections. I don't know if they meant it, but at least electorally they thought it would be useful. Let's do something Hindu. And so if our allies, whom we need to have a majority, object, well, then we can have a big, well-publicized quarrel with the allies to prove how pro-Hindu we are. And if the allies come around and we can vote these pro-Hindu things, even better. then we can show, you see, we really achieved something for the Hindus, vote for us. Now that was not done. Vajpayee cold-shouldered the proposal, and the result was that they lost. They thought they could do it on the strength of Vikas. At the time, India was economically going very strong. After all the misery under Congress, you see, now they came back. But at that time, the common Indian did not yet profit from this. It's only the business class that really saw the difference. And that's not enough to win elections with. So now you see under Modi in 2019, finally, many of the things he did were reaching the masses and really made a difference for the mood of the electorate. And so he won with an unprecedented victory. Right, but you see, now more than ever, there is nothing anymore of this pro-Hindu thing. The thing that came closest was the normalization of Kashmir, the abolition of Article 370. But there, if you look closely, in Article 370, there is no mention of Hindu or Muslim. You see, it pretends to be a totally secular issue. And indeed, recently some governor or something, some government person said that, we should stop thinking about Kashmir in terms of religion. No, of course, you see, the driving out of the Kashmiri Pandits was entirely religiously motivated. The fact that Kashmir has a special status was, of course, arranged by Nehru precisely to appease the Muslims, you see. Because, of course, there had been a Hindu separatism from the Dogri Maharaja, but he didn't need to be appeased. Once there was a new decision at the national level, he just accepted it. It's the Muslims that started terror movement and so on. Yet, this is never mentioned. You see, the laws that were there or that were, changed by Modi do not say anything about religion. I very much doubt if he would have done it if it was explicitly pro-Hindu. Though, of course, I support it. I mean, I was also very glad when it happened. But so, if you see the recent statements from government persons, like Modi himself, who said, "Oh, we have to follow the example of the Prophet," or his glorifying the sons of Govind Singh, the so-called Sahibzade, the Chote Sahibzade, for giving their life rather than their Hinduism. He managed to go through the whole thing, even mentioning the name Aurangzeb, but not mentioning the religions, what this was about. These boys were not killed because they were, I don't know, Punjabi nationalists or any secular designation you can invent. No, they were killed because they were Hindus and wanted to remain so. This simply continues the secularist policies of preceding Congress governments. Now, maybe that's good, you can argue that, but at any rate, it's not what people expected from a fanatical Hindu party, which is how everybody keeps describing the BJP.